The time has finally come. If all goes well, at the end of the day, this engine will be in that truck. Whether it's running at that point remains to be seen. I just got a little bit more part swapping to do. But before I go ahead and swap the Dodge Ram manifolds on, I wanted to go ahead and show you a few differences and similarities I've found. So at the middle here you have the Dodge Dakota manifolds. You can tell because they're rusty and they have the head pipe still attached to them. And on the top and the bottom we have the Dodge Ram manifolds. Now obviously the passenger side manifolds are not the same. They do bolt up the same, however the Dakota has this really long bend on the end of the manifold and the Dodge Ram just kind of ends right there, so those won't interchange. The driver's side manifolds actually seem to be almost identical, however. You could keep the Dakota manifold and it would bolt up just fine. The only real difference I've found is that the Dakota manifolds for some reason have these slots that open up to the sides on the end of the manifolds, and it's like that on both of them. I'm not really sure why they did that. I mean, best I can tell, it's probably just going to mainly allow more contaminants to enter and rust out the bolts. But you can really tell here the difference between a northern and a southern truck. Now this truck originally came from Georgia, and you can see it's got all the original bolts on it. These are all original, none of them have been replaced. And we're going to be reusing all of them, but the Dakota manifolds, most of those bolts broke or rounded off or were just completely rotted. So, and this Dakota engine did come from New York, so this really says a lot about how different environments can affect a vehicle. So we're going to bolt on the manifolds, get some other things swapped out, and then we'll be ready to put it in the truck. I'm in the middle of swapping the exhaust manifolds. I got to the driver's side exhaust manifold and I noticed that there's this port here. Now this port is normally for exhaust gas if you have an EGR valve. This one doesn't have an EGR valve, so this port just dead ends. But the reason that port's existence is important is because if you look at the manifolds, the Dodge Ram doesn't have a provision for that port, but the Dakota did, even though this engine didn't have an EGR valve. This port just connects to the rest of the exhaust manifold and supplies exhaust gas through that port to the EGR valve on EGR equipped vehicles. Now if you are not using an EGR, if you don't have an EGR valve, or you're putting an EGR engine into a non-EGR vehicle and you're not going to use the EGR, this isn't really a big deal. You can just go ahead and use whichever manifold you want. And in fact, if you use one of these manifolds that doesn't have the provision for the EGR valve, you wouldn't even need to use a block off plate here. You could just go ahead and leave it open because it's not going to affect anything. That is provided, of course, you swap the intake manifold to a non-EGR intake. However, if you do have an EGR valve and you are putting it into a vehicle with EGR, you're going to want to make sure that you get one of these manifolds that has the provision for that port, because if you put a manifold that doesn't have that provision onto an EGR head and into an EGR vehicle, what's going to happen is anytime the EGR valve opens, instead of taking an exhaust gas, it's just going to suck a whole bunch of unfiltered, unmetered air directly into the intake manifold, and it's not going to run well at all if it stays running. And honestly, it would probably die because this is a speed density system and it relies on manifold vacuum to run properly. So just a quick little thing I wanted to point out, because that is kind of important if you have an EGR valve that you're going to be using. If you don't, you can go ahead and just use one of these manifolds that doesn't have the EGR valve. The nice thing is that the driver's side manifolds should interchange between the two different vehicle types. So if you find yourself needing a exhaust manifold with that EGR provision, you could probably just use it off whatever vehicle you need to. So if I needed EGR on this vehicle, I could just use the Dakota manifold, just leave it bolted up, and it would bolt right up to my head pipe, no problems. But I don't, and it's rusty, so I'm going to stick with the Dodge Ram manifold. So I'm finally ready to put the engine in now. We got it all set up here. I swapped the water pump, manifolds are on. I did remove the throttle body because I know from experience that if you try to put these engines in or out with the intake manifold on, the throttle body is going to want to hit up there. The block plate is on, and one of the things that's a little bit different between the engines is that on the Dakota, these dowel pins are in the transmission case rather than in the engine, but on the Dodge Ram, they're in the engine, so you just gotta pop those out. Luckily, they're not blind holes, so you just get a drift from the backside, pop it out, and then pop it in to your new engine, and you're good to go. The block plate will go on without removing the flex plate, but I would strongly recommend you put it on before you put the dowel pins in, because that'll make it a lot easier on you. The flex plate is the Dakota flex plate. We're keeping that one because it's less work. Turns out it is exactly the same as the Dodge Ram. I looked up the flex plate for a Dodge Ram and for a Dodge Dakota on an OEM Chrysler parts site, and it's the same exact part number. The holes that were in the edges that I saw, excuse me, on the old flex plate, I believe those are just for balancing, and being that this one has less holes, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this one was probably better balanced from the factory, so I'd say it's an improvement. For lifting, these engines are not the easiest in the world to lift. There aren't really a whole lot of good points to lift them from, so I'm doing this pretty much the same way the old one came out. We're going around the exhaust manifolds and then to the bolt on the front timing cover. And I'd prefer to use a load leveler and chains for this, but I know from experience taking it out that the load leveler is not going to have enough clearance to clear that overhang, because like I said, the throttle body will get in the way of that, so this might actually get in the way of that, but hopefully it doesn't. So not the ideal setup, but it should work. These straps are rated to 1,000 pounds and this weighs about 500 or so. For the engine bay, we've got the radiator out. I'm leaving the condenser and the AC compressor in. I prefer to leave that stuff intact whenever I can, and I know I can get it in because I got it out with that stuff intact. For the hoist, some of you may have already guessed this, but my driveway is not level, it's on an angle, which is not ideal. And being that this engine weighs upwards of 500 pounds, there's no way I can hold it while guiding it down into there. So what we do instead is I got the ATV here, and it's blocked off on all four wheels, and I'll basically just use the winch to move it forwards and backwards, and then all I have to do is move it side to side to adjust it. So the way this is going to go in is we're going to go up. We'll have to clear this, so we'll get it high enough so that the heads and the motor mounts will clear it. Then we can come back down and slide it in there and then bolt it right up. Hopefully it goes smoothly. Okay, so I know this is a giant rat's nest and it might be kind of hard to see, but basically what's going on is I need to get the AC compressor on this side of all the lifting points without taking the engine back out. So what I'm going to do is basically we're going to transfer the load from one strap to another while it's still hanging. I'm going to go right to the manifold mounting hole. And I'm going to tighten this down and take the string off the other one. Now this one's loose enough. Take this one off. We're just kind of jammed, so we'll take it off down here. All the while being careful that I don't get crushed. Well, I won't get crushed, my feet could get crushed, or my hand could get crushed, but I'll be fine. It's just all even see body parts. No big deal. Okay, we'll cinch this back up. And I'll take this strap off. And there, now the hose is under it. So now we just got to do that one, and then that one, and we'll work it all the way to the front. That will give us plenty of space to move without getting in the way. And I know what you're all thinking. Why didn't you just disconnect the AC compressor? Well, because although I have the tools to evacuate the system and recharge it, it's a pain in the ass. And I just don't want to. Also, if you're doing this at home, you probably don't have those tools. So, yeah. I'm now at a point where the engine will no longer go in any farther because the flex plate's starting to hit the transmission. The transmission is by no means in the same spot it needs to be, so we're going to get under here. We're going to take these jack stands out and get get a jack under here. We'll lift the transmission up so we can slide the engine together. So it's into the motor mount area now. So pretty close, we just gotta get lined up with the transmission. So I got the engine in. Once you get the dowel pins lined up, it just kind of pops right into the transmission. And then I got the two biggest bolts holding it to the transmission right now, and that's it aside from the dowel pins. It's really just kind of resting there, but it's too dark for me to continue and have you be able to see it, so I'm going to call it quits now. And Just in the meantime, I've got a little bottle jack there, just kind of holding the transmission so there's not so much stress on those few little bolts and dowel pins, but it is in, so we'll come back tomorrow, put everything together, and we should be able to get it running. Next day, and the engine's all bolted up. It's bolted to the transmission and the motor mounts are bolted in. I didn't record that because the bolts on the top here, you can see there's not a whole lot of space to work, and if I get the camera in there, you're not going to be able to see it. Plus, I'm not going to have any space to get my hands in there, so didn't record that. There's 4 bolts on the top that bolt from the transmission side into the engine, and then on the side, these 2 really big honking bolts that bolt the engine into the transmission. Those are the ones I put in last. So it's pretty much in there for good now. And now we're going to work on getting the torque converter bolted in. Going to try to get this done today, but I don't know if I will because it looks like it's going to rain, and it already has a little bit, so we'll see. So this part's going to be hard to tape. It's also going to be one of the bigger annoyances of this job. It's getting the torque converter bolted up. So what we have to do is get this torque converter lined up with the flex plate holes and then bolt it up. It's got 4 bolts that hold it on this truck. Now, a bit of advice whenever you do a swap on this vehicle or any automatic transmission vehicle anyway, you want to make sure the torque converter is seated all the way. If it's not seated all the way and you bolt it together, the first time you start the engine, it's going to basically ruin the entire front of your transmission, if not the whole thing. So you want to make sure it's seated properly. And one of the ways you can tell if it's seated properly all the way once you bolt it up is your torque converter should be able to rotate fairly freely. You can see I'm just sticking my finger in there and I can rotate it with just my finger. That's how you know it's seated all the way. And when you go to bolt it up, it'll actually get pulled towards the torque converter to match up, or it'll get pulled towards the engine to match up with the flex plate when you bolt it down. If you bolt it together and it feels like it's sandwiched to the flex plate, then you probably don't have it seated properly. So, you see where these bolts are. It's going to be easier once you get one bolt lined up. If the bolt would actually thread in. There it goes. Now we're not going to tighten these all the way down until I get all of them in, and the reason I'm not going to do that is I don't want to accidentally make it unaligned by bolting down one bolt and then have to either loosen it up to get the other bolts in or have it be uneven. So we're going to just finger tighten the bolts at first, and now what we have to do is rotate the crank. And I'll move the camera here. If you look, you can see, yeah, I know the camera's going everywhere, but you're looking at this from my view. You can see I already have a breaker bar with a socket on the front of the crank to go ahead and turn the engine, and now I'm going to try to blindly get this lined up to where you can see it again. Yeah, pretty close. Okay, that should be good. So, while I'm under here, I'm going to reach forward on the breaker bar and rotate the engine. That's the other thing. If your torque converter isn't seated properly, you probably won't be able to rotate the engine easily. So, we get it turned to our next bolt. And we put the bolt in. Okay. Rotate it again. And you can hear it kind of clunking in there because the bolts are still loose. And if you ever get one of these with a knock, being a 4.7, there's a good chance that the engine's knocking, but if you get a knock that goes away when you put it in drive or put load on it, it's possible that your torque converter to flex plate bolts are loose, or the flex plate to crank bolts. I've seen that before, but unfortunately, that wasn't the case on this engine. It was a rod knock. And this will be the last one. Now you can tighten them down, and ideally you'd like to do this with a torque wrench, but I don't think there's enough space in there for a torque wrench, to be honest. And you can see now, it's actually pulling the torque converter towards the flex plate, just like I said. Go ahead, and just as a precaution, I'm going to tighten the rest of them down that way before I really torque them down. And I don't know if you can see this, but there's actually a noticeable gap between the head of the bolt and the flex plate from when it pulled the torque converter up to the flex plate. Yeah, see, you don't want to just start hammering down on these torque converter bolts. Yeah, you see that huge gap? It wasn't seated all the way. So if we just tighten the crap out of that one bolt, probably would have ended up being uneven. And it may have run, but it probably would have ended up cracking the flex plate sooner or later, and we'd be taking the engine out again. It's one of those situations where it doesn't hurt to be careful. The torque converter bolts are all snug down, and I've got this cradle, girdle, bracket, whatever the heck you want to call this. Yeah, there's lines in the way. This will go right in here, just like that. And that ties the bottom of the engine to the transmission, and Dodge uses this in lieu of a inspection plate cover. So put that on, we'll put the cross brace on, and then we'll go back topside and start working on stuff up there. So pretty much everything on the bottom here is done. We got the cradle installed, we got the brace, exhaust, starter, all that's done. Now I didn't film that because there's nothing special to it, it's just bolting the stuff back on. But if you want to make this easy on yourself, what you want to do is you're going to go cradle, exhaust, starter, and then this brace in that order, and that's going to make it easiest for you. You want to put the brace in last so it gives you plenty of clearance. It's easier to get to the exhaust if you don't have the starter in. Now when you put the starter in, there's very little clearance for the actual power cable that goes to the starter, so you're going to want to bolt that on to the starter before you actually install the starter. The connector itself you can wait until after it's in, but the cable, there's definitely not hardly any space at all in there for it, so get that on before you put that in. So go back up to the top now. I bolted down the AC compressor and the alternator, and at this point all the big stuff is in. It's mainly just a lot of tedious little stuff. We got a lot of hoses and a lot of wiring harnesses to connect back up and the throttle body, and I'm probably not going to record much else until I get to at least the radiator and the fan, simply because it would all end up fast forwarded anyway, and it's just going to take up time in the video. Plus I'm just not feeling it right now. I really want to get this done. So I will tell you though, I know these harnesses, they look kind of intimidating when you've got all these connectors here, especially if you're like me and you didn't label any of them, and you might be nervous about getting them back in the same spot. Well, I'm going to tell you how you can make sure you do that. Number one, when you look at the harness, they're meant to fit the engine and the vehicle in a certain way. So if I just throw it like that, you see now that doesn't look right. It doesn't look like it'll match up anything. But if I lay it here, which this is the routing, you'll notice suddenly all the connectors are going right to where they need to be. So that's how you can tell on the routing. And as far as the connectors themselves, you might be worried that you can accidentally plug the wrong thing into the wrong place. But believe it or not, most of these connectors are different. They won't go into the wrong spot. Now the only connector I've noticed so far that is the same is this one. See here? And then I've got another one, I think it's this one. Yep, this one right here. These are actually the same exact connector. So you might think you might be able to mix them up, but you notice this one has a long cable, goes all the way down, and then it plugs into the oil pressure sender. And then this one plugs into the AC up here. You'd have to really do some contorting to mix them up. Plus, you notice this one only has one terminal and a 2-pin connector. And that sensor is the only other sensor with that connector that has one terminal in it. So it's not too hard to get them in the right spots. And as for the ones that are repeated, like the coil packs and the injectors, those are of course different connectors. But the main thing is you just start at the back and then go forward, and that way you'll know for sure if you miss something, because you'll either have one empty connector at the back and you won't have one for the coil pack at the front or the injector at the front. It just won't seem right. When you got it right, it's all going to fit together perfectly. So to make sure this course support is lined up properly, I'm just using the marks in the paint, both on the mount and on the bolts. Just make sure it's in the same place it came out of. And it doesn't seem to really want to sit in any other position than the position it came out of, so that just helps. And of course the battery is dead. So this radiator was sitting in the back of the truck, and the tape covering up the hole had come off. So I flushed it just to be sure, and there was a frog in it. So I guess it's a good thing I flushed it. that this is actually the easiest way to install and remove the fan on most vehicles. A lot of people, they want to try to take the shroud out and then the fan out, or the fan out then the shroud out. The problem with that is that whatever you decide to take out last ends up getting in the way of whatever you're trying to take out. So it might seem like a pain in the ass, but it's actually easier if you just set them all down at once, and then you can just lean the fan up against the engine while you put the shroud in, or thread it on just a little bit like I have. So now we're going to tighten down this fan clutch the easy way. And just spin it on by hand right now. The clutch will actually free spin, but it's got enough resistance that as long as your threads aren't boogered, it'll actually spin the nose. And you can actually see now, this is at least twice the length as the one on the Dakota clutch. And you don't need any special tools to get this tightened or loosened. Well, usually you don't need special tools to get it loosened. So instead of going with like a pulley holder and a specialty fan clutch wrench, here's the easy way to do it. Get yourself an adjustable wrench. We're going to snug that down a little bit until it starts moving. Take a dead blow hammer and just whack it a few times. And once more for good measure. And that's it. That's all you need to do. And no, it's not going to come off, because the way these threads are on there, when the engine's turning, it's always trying to tighten that fan clutch on there. The only time you end up with a loosening force on there is if you are heavy on the throttle, let off real quick, and the fan wants to keep going. But usually then it'll just spin the fan clutch, and the amount of force it's going to put on there trying to loosen it is minimal, when most of the time the force is trying to tighten it. So just give me a quick whack with the hammer. That's all that it takes to keep it on there. And I know from experience it won't come off, because I drove this thing for 10,000 miles, and that's the way I put the fan clutch on last time I did that. So the moment of truth, find out if it runs, which I think it will. So. So engine's hot now. Oil pressure is sitting just over 30. So the concern is that needle is bouncing. It really should be steady. So the oil pressure is really good. The bouncing needle is not good. And we're at about, I'd say we're between 32 and 30. I'd say we're bouncing 2 to 3 psi. We'll give it a rev here. And the oil pressure just goes way high, and so it's got tons of oil pressure, it's just that it bounces. The more you rev it, the less it bounces, but it's still bouncing a little. yeah, so swap successful, engine, not so sure. So still having that oil pressure fluctuation issue, but at this point I'm leaning towards it being either the gauge or a false reading somehow and not an internal engine problem. The reason I say that is because the bottom line is that I took this around the block, got heavy on the throttle a few times, and the engine was perfectly quiet, smooth, had plenty of power the entire time. No noises at all, which if it did have oil pressure problems, I would think it would be making noises. Now the old engine, it did run well and smoothly and didn't make any noises at first. But what that one did do is when you started it up after it had been sitting for a few days, it would actually knock very briefly when you started it up, because what was happening is the clearances were too big in one of the bearings and it would have to pump the oil into that and it would quiet down after that. That engine also had a light tick noise that would start from about, I'd say 1500 RPM, and then eventually it would quiet down and get lost as you got into the upper rev ranges. This engine doesn't have any of those noises at all, so I'm thinking it's really probably a gauge issue or a false reading. I'm going to continue looking into that because I'm not entirely 100% sure and I want to figure out exactly what the problem is, but I think it'll be okay. But I want to wrap the video up here simply because this isn't about figuring out why the oil pressure bounces. It was about getting a Dakota engine into a Dodge Ram, and I've done that. Everything works well, it drives well, so I'm going to call this swap a success. And now I do know a lot of people are going to ask exactly what parts have to be swapped out, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put two lists down in the description. One list is going to be the parts that I swapped, and the other list is going to be the parts that have to be swapped because they're different. The reason I'm going to do two lists is because I swapped a couple of parts that were exactly the same. The only difference is mine were either in better condition or they looked better. For example, the valve covers, those weren't necessary to be swapped, and the coil packs, those were the same as well, but I swapped them just because mine were in better shape. So yeah, we're gonna go ahead, leave it off now, and I'm sure people will wonder about this, so in the future I will be doing an update video and I will address the oil pressure problem, because at the same time I need to address whatever happened with the rear end, because the rear end was underwater, and that is a video for another time.